The blizzard came down like God's own fury that February afternoon in 1884, turning the rocky hills of northern Nevada into a white wasteland where nothing lived and everything died. And Fiona Zimmerman knew the 9 men tracking her through the snow would kill her the moment they caught up. She'd been riding hard for 3 hours since leaving Carlin, her chestnut mare struggling through drifts that came up past her knees, and the wind howled so fierce she could barely see 10 feet ahead. The horse stumbled again, foam at her mouth, and Fiona knew they couldn't go much further. Behind her, she could hear the distant shouts of the men, their voices carrying on the wind like the calls of hunting wolves. Her fingers were numb inside her leather gloves, and her face felt like it had been scraped raw by the ice and wind. The heavy wool coat she wore did little against the penetrating cold, and her skirts were soaked through from the snow. She'd made a mistake back in Carlin, a terrible mistake, and now she was paying for it with her life. All she'd done was witness something she shouldn't have seen, stumbled upon it really, when she'd gone to the livery stable to check on her horse. The Carson Gang had been there, counting money from their latest robbery, and their leader, a cruel man named Vincent Carson, had looked up and seen her standing in the doorway. She'd run then, mounted her horse and fled, but they'd come after her immediately, all 9 of them, determined to make sure she never told anyone what she'd seen. The mare whinnied in distress and stopped completely, her sides heaving. Fiona dismounted, her boots sinking deep into the snow, and tried to pull the horse forward, but the animal wouldn't budge. She was done, finished, and Fiona realized with a sinking heart that she would have to continue on foot. She left the mare there, hoping the poor creature would survive, and pushed forward through the blizzard, her legs burning with the effort of lifting them through the deep snow. The voices behind her grew louder, closer, and she knew they'd gained ground. Her heart hammered in her chest, and tears froze on her cheeks as she stumbled forward, praying for a miracle she didn't deserve. That's when she saw the dark shape ahead, a structure of some kind, barely visible through the white curtain of snow. Hope surged in her chest, and she pushed toward it with renewed desperation, her lungs burning from the cold air. As she got closer, she could see it was a small cabin, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney rising from one side. Smoke rose from the chimney, which meant someone was home, someone who might help her. She reached the door and pounded on it with her frozen fists, looking back over her shoulder at the shapes emerging from the storm behind her. The door opened, and a man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes the color of aged whiskey. He took one look at her face, then passed her at the riders approaching through the snow, and made his decision in an instant. He pulled her inside, slammed the door, and dropped a heavy wooden bar across it. The cabin was warm, blessedly warm, with a fire crackling in the stone hearth, and Fiona collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. "How many?" he asked, his voice deep and calm despite the situation. "9, she managed to say through chattering teeth. "The Carson Gang. They're going to kill me." He nodded once, then moved to the window, peering out through the shutters. "I know of them. Murderers and thieves, everyone." He turned back to her, and she saw he wore a gun belt, 2 revolvers holstered at his hips. "Stay down and away from the windows." "Who are you?" she asked. "Dalton Jeremiah," he said. "Used to ride for the law up in Montana. Now I prospect for silver and mind my own business." He checked his revolvers, spinning the cylinders to ensure they were fully loaded. "Looks like my business just got complicated." The pounding came at the door then, heavy fists hammering against the wood. "Open up in there," a voice shouted. "We know she's with you." "Send her out and we'll leave you be." Dalton looked at Fiona and she shook her head desperately. He seemed to understand something in her eyes, some truth that needed no words, and he called back, "Can't do that. The lady's under my protection now." There was laughter from outside, mean and ugly. "Your protection? That's real touching, mister, but there's 9 of us and one of you. You ain't got a prayer." "Then I'll die praying," Dalton said, and moved away from the door. The shooting started a moment later, bullets slamming into the door and walls, thudding against the thick logs. Dalton pushed Fiona down behind a heavy wooden table he'd tipped on its side, then positioned himself at the window. When he fired back, the sound was deafening in the small space, and Fiona covered her ears. Through the gap in the shutters, she could see the men spreading out, trying to surround the cabin, dark figures moving through the white storm. Dalton fired with careful precision, not wasting a single shot. The first man fell clutching his shoulder, spinning around in the snow before collapsing. The second took a bullet to the leg and went down screaming. Dalton moved to the other window, fired twice more, and 2 more men fell. The remaining men started shooting wildly, panic replacing their earlier confidence. Dalton's face was set in hard lines, concentrating, and he fired again from the first window. Another man dropped into the snow and didn't move. "That's 5 down," he said quietly, reloading with practiced speed. One of the remaining men made a rush for the door, and Dalton shot him through the window before he'd made it halfway across the yard. The man crumpled like a puppet with cut strings. The last 3 seemed to have had enough. Through the howling wind, Fiona heard shouting and then the thunder of horses' hooves. Dalton watched from the window as the 3 survivors fled back toward Carlin, disappearing into the white curtain of the blizzard. "They're running," he said, lowering his weapons. "Won't likely come back, not after losing 6 men. Fiona realized she was shaking, and not just from the cold. The violence had happened so fast, so brutally efficient that her mind could barely process it. Dalton holstered his revolvers and came to kneel beside her, his face softening with concern. "You're safe now," he said gently. "They won't bother you again." "You killed them," she whispered. 6 men. "I did what needed doing," he said simply. "Those men would have killed you without a second thought, and probably me too, just for the fun of it. I've heard about the Carson Gang. They're wanted in 3 territories for murder and worse." He reached out carefully and touched her hand. "You're frozen through. Let's get you warm before you lose any fingers." He helped her to her feet and guided her to a chair near the fire. Her legs barely held her, and she sank into the seat gratefully. Dalton brought her a blanket, thick wool that smelled of pine and smoke, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Then he poured something from a bottle into a tin cup and pressed it into her hands. "Drink this. It'll help." She sipped it and coughed as the whiskey burned down her throat, but warmth followed the burn, spreading through her chest. He knelt and pulled off her soaked boots, then her stockings, examining her feet with a practiced eye. "No frostbite that I can see, but it was close. Keep them near the fire." He stood and went to stoke the flames higher, adding more wood from a neat stack beside the hearth. Fiona watched him move around the cabin, this stranger who had just saved her life without hesitation. He was perhaps 30 years old, with a lean, weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. There was a quiet competence to everything he did, an economy of movement that suggested someone comfortable in his own skin. When he caught her looking at him, he gave her a slight smile. "Feel free to ask," he said. "I know you must have questions." "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You don't know me. I could be anyone." "You're someone running from 9 armed men in a blizzard," he said. "That told me everything I needed to know." He pulled up another chair and sat across from her. "Besides, I saw your face when I suggested sending you out. You were terrified. Whatever they wanted with you, it wasn't anything good." "I saw them," Fiona said quietly. The Carson Gang in the livery stable in Carlin. They were counting money from a robbery. Their leader saw me and I ran. She pulled the blanket tighter. I knew if they caught me, I'd disappear like all the others who have crossed them. Dalton nodded slowly. Vincent Carson. He's got a reputation for being thorough when it comes to witnesses. You did the right thing running. He studied her face. You're not from around here, are you? San Francisco originally, she said. I came to Carlin 6 months ago to teach at the school. My father thought it would be an adventure. She laughed bitterly. Some adventure. Teaching's important work, Dalton said. Takes courage to come out to a rough town like Carlin and try to civilize the next generation. Not as much courage as facing down 9 men in a blizzard, she said softly. He looked uncomfortable with the praise. I've done harder things in my time. When I rode for the law, we'd track outlaws for weeks through worse than this. He stood and moved to the window again, checking the storm. This blizzard's going to last through the night at least. You'll need to stay here until it clears. I couldn't impose, Fiona started, but he waved her objection away. It's not an imposition. It's survival. You'd freeze to death trying to get back to Carlin in this weather, and your horse is probably dead or run off by now anyway. He came back to the fire. I've got a cot you can take. I'll make do with the floor. I can't take your bed, she protested. Yes, you can and you will, he said firmly. I've slept on worse than a cabin floor, believe me. They fell into silence for a while, listening to the wind howl around the cabin and the crack of the fire. Fiona felt herself beginning to thaw, the terrible cold leaching out of her bones slowly. Her fingers tingled painfully as feeling returned to them, and she flexed them under the blanket. Dalton busied himself preparing food. Simple fare of salt pork and beans heated in an iron pot hung over the fire, and cornbread left over from his breakfast. He served it to her on a tin plate, and she realized she was ravenous. They ate together without talking much, and Fiona found herself stealing glances at him over her food. There was something solid and reassuring about him, something that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in months. Life in Carlin had been harder than she'd expected, rougher and more dangerous, and she'd learned to keep her guard up constantly. But here, in this small cabin with this quiet man who had killed to protect her, she felt she could finally breathe. Tell me about Montana, she said when they'd finished eating. You said you rode for the law there. I was a territorial marshal for 5 years, Dalton said, settling back in his chair. Good work mostly, keeping the peace in the mining camps and small towns. But it wore on me after a while, all the violence and death. I saw too many good men killed for nothing, and too many bad men get away with murder because they had money or connections. He stared into the fire. I resigned last year and came down to Nevada to try my hand at prospecting. Figured I'd rather dig for silver than dig graves. Have you found any? She asked. Silver, I mean. A little. Enough to keep me fed and warm through the winter. There's a decent vein running through the hill behind this cabin. I work it when the weather's good and read when it's not. He gestured to a shelf lined with books, more than she would have expected to find in a prospector's cabin. You're a reader, she said, surprised and pleased. Surprised. He smiled slightly. I may live rough, but I try not to let my mind go to seed. I've got Shakespeare, Dickens, some Emerson, even a couple of dime novels for when I want something less taxing. He paused. What about you? What do you read? Everything I can get my hands on, Fiona said. It's harder out here. Books are expensive and hard to come by, but I brought a trunk full with me from San Francisco. I have my students read from them when I can. She felt herself relaxing, the terror of the afternoon fading into something more manageable. I never expected to find a prospector who quotes Shakespeare. "I never expected to find a schoolteacher running from outlaws in a blizzard," he countered. "Seems we're both full of surprises." The storm continued through the night, and Dalton made good on his promise, giving Fiona the narrow cot in the corner and making himself a bedroll on the floor near the fire. She protested again, but he was immovable, and eventually she gave in, too exhausted to argue further. She lay under the rough blankets, listening to the wind and the crackle of the fire, and felt safer than she had in months. Across the room, she could hear Dalton's steady breathing, and somehow that sound more than anything else allowed her to finally sleep. She woke to pale sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and the smell of coffee brewing. Dalton was already up, dressed and moving quietly around the small space. When he saw she was awake, he poured her a cup of coffee and brought it over. "Storm's past," he said. "Skies clear as crystal out there. Beautiful morning if you can forget about the 6 dead men frozen in the snow outside." Fiona sat up, taking the coffee gratefully. "What will we do about them?" "I'll ride into Carlin later and notify the sheriff," Dalton said. "He'll need to come out and identify the bodies, collect any bounties that might be on them. The Carson Gang's been active for a couple of years now, so there's probably paper on most of them." He sipped his own coffee. "You'll need to give a statement too, tell him what happened." "Will there be trouble?" she asked. "For you, I mean. You killed 6 men." "Self-defense," Dalton said firmly. "They attacked my property and threatened an innocent woman. Any reasonable lawman will see it that way." He paused. "If the sheriff in Carlin gives us trouble, we'll wire the territorial marshal. I still have friends in the service." The word "us" didn't escape Fiona's notice, and she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee or the fire. This man who barely knew her was already thinking of them as a unit, already planning to protect her from whatever consequences might come. It touched something deep in her chest, something that had been cold and lonely for longer than she wanted to admit. They spent the morning putting the cabin back in order, repairing the bullet holes in the shutters as best they could, and clearing snow away from the door. Dalton went out and checked the bodies, covering them with canvas tarps weighted down with rocks. He found Fiona's horse wandering nearby, cold and tired but alive, and led her back to his small stable behind the cabin where he kept his own mount, a sturdy buckskin gelding. "She's a tough one," he said, rubbing the mare's nose. "Most horses would have died out there last night." "Her name is Copper," Fiona said, stroking the horse's neck. "I bought her when I first came to Carlin. She's been good to me." "She's got good lines," Dalton said approvingly. "Spanish blood in her somewhere, I'd wager. Fast and smart." They saddled both horses and rode back toward Carlin together, following the trail Fiona had made in her desperate flight the day before. The snow was deep, but the sky was brilliantly blue, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Fiona stayed close to Dalton, feeling safer with him beside her, and they talked as they rode, sharing stories about their lives. She learned he'd grown up in Kansas, the son of a farmer who died when Dalton was 16. He'd worked cattle drives to make money, then drifted into law work when he proved handy with a gun. He'd never married, never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots. She told him about her life in San Francisco, growing up as the daughter of a banker who'd wanted sons, but got only one daughter instead. She'd been educated at the best schools, trained to be a lady, but she'd always felt restless and constrained by city life. Teaching in Carlin had seemed like an escape, a chance to do something meaningful with her life, but the reality had been harder and lonelier than she'd imagined. "You regret it?" Dalton asked. "Coming out here?" "I did yesterday," she admitted, "but not today." She looked at him, meeting his eyes. "Today I'm glad I came." Something passed between them in that moment, some unspoken understanding, and Dalton reached over and took her hand briefly before releasing it. "I'm glad you came too," he said quietly. They reached Carlin by midday, riding down the main street past the false-fronted buildings and saloons. People stopped to stare at them, and Fiona could feel the weight of their curiosity. She rode straight-backed and proud, refusing to show any shame or fear. They went directly to the sheriff's office, a small building near the center of town, and tied their horses outside. The sheriff was a grizzled man in his 50s named Tom Crawford, and he listened to their story with narrowed eyes and occasional grunts. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and scratched his beard. "The Carson Gang's been a thorn in my side for 2 years," he said finally. "If what you're saying is true and 6 of them are dead, that's the best news I've had in a long while." He looked at Dalton. "You say you used to be a marshal, 5 years in Montana Territory," Dalton confirmed. "You can wire Marshal Henry Porter in Helena if you want confirmation." "I will," Crawford said. "Not that I doubt you, but I like to be thorough." He stood and reached for his coat. "Let's ride out and have a look at these bodies. If they're who you say they are, there's reward money coming to you, Mr. Jeremiah. Maybe as much as $500. The 3 of them rode back out to Dalton's cabin, and Sheriff Crawford examined the bodies carefully, comparing their faces to wanted posters he'd brought with him. 5 of the 6 were indeed members of the Carson Gang, with prices on their heads ranging from $50 to $200. The 6th was a drifter they'd apparently recruited recently, and there was no paper on him. "Vincent Carson wasn't among them?" Crawford asked. "No," Fiona said. "He was their leader, the one I saw in the livery. He must have been one of the 3 who ran." Crawford nodded grimly. "That's bad news. With most of his gang dead, he'll be desperate and dangerous. Might come after you again, Miss Zimmerman, to tie up loose ends." He looked at Dalton. "She ought to have protection for a while, at least until we can track Carson down and bring him in." "She'll stay with me," Dalton said immediately. "Out here at the cabin. Carson won't try anything with me around, and if he does, he'll end up like his men." Fiona started to protest, worried about her reputation, but Crawford waved her concerns away. "Under the circumstances, I think propriety can take a back seat to survival, Miss Zimmerman. Besides, Mr. Jeremiah seems like a gentleman, and I'll make it clear to anyone who asks that this is protective custody, not anything improper." He looked at Dalton. "I'll send word if we hear anything about Carson's whereabouts." They returned to Carlin, so Fiona could collect some of her belongings from the small house she rented near the school. Her landlady, a pinched-faced woman named Mrs. Hutchins, was scandalized by the whole affair and tried to lecture Fiona about the impropriety of staying with an unmarried man. Fiona, who had faced death less than 24 hours ago, found she had no patience for the woman's small-mindedness. "I'll be murdered or I'll be gossiped about," she said crisply. "I choose gossip, Mrs. Hutchins. Good day." She packed 2 carpetbags with clothes, books, and personal items, and left word at the school that she would be absent for a week or possibly longer. The school board would have to find a substitute teacher or manage without her. Then she and Dalton rode back to the cabin, arriving as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Over the next few days, they fell into an easy routine. Dalton would work his claim during the daylight hours, while Fiona kept the cabin tidy and prepared meals. It was domestic in a way neither of them had experienced before, and they both found they liked it. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and read together, sometimes aloud to each other, sometimes in companionable silence. They talked for hours, sharing thoughts and dreams and fears, getting to know each other in a way that felt both natural and profound. Fiona found herself watching him when he didn't notice, admiring the strong line of his jaw and the gentle way he handled everything from the horses to the firewood. He was kind without being soft, strong without being brutal, and he treated her with a respect she'd rarely encountered in men. When he looked at her, she felt seen in a way that made her heart beat faster. Dalton was equally captivated by her. She was intelligent and well-spoken, but there was a core of steel in her that had allowed her to survive in a rough town like Carlin. She didn't complain about the primitive conditions in the cabin or the simple food. Instead, she threw herself into their shared life with enthusiasm, finding ways to improve things with the limited resources available. She mended his clothes without being asked, organized his books, and even helped him sort ore samples in the evenings. More than that, she made him laugh, something he hadn't done much of in recent years. On the fifth evening, as they sat together reading, Dalton reached over and took her hand. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and saw something there that made her breath catch. "Fiona," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "These past few days with you have been the happiest I can remember in years," he said. "I know we've only just met, and I know the circumstances were terrible, but I can't help feeling that maybe it was meant to be, like you were supposed to run through that blizzard and end up at my door." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm falling in love with you, Fiona. I think I have been since the moment I saw you standing there, frozen and terrified but still fighting." Tears pricked at Fiona's eyes, but they were good tears, joyful tears. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I didn't think it was possible to feel this way so quickly, but I do. When I'm with you, I feel safe and happy and like myself in a way I never have before." He pulled her closer, and she went to him willingly, settling against his chest as his arms came around her. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other by the firelight, not kissing yet but sharing something deeper, a connection that went beyond physical attraction. When Dalton finally tilted her face up and kissed her, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Fiona kissed him back, pouring all her newfound feelings into it, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling. "I don't want you to go back to Carlin," Dalton said. "I want you to stay here with me." "I want that too," Fiona said, "but I have obligations. My teaching position, my students." "Marry me," Dalton said suddenly. "I know it's fast, I know people will talk, but I don't care. Marry me, Fiona, be my wife. You can still teach if you want, we can get a bigger place closer to town, or you can leave the school and we'll make our life here. Whatever you want, as long as we're together." Fiona felt her heart soar. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you, Dalton Jeremiah. I'll be your wife and I'll stay with you and we'll build a life together." They kissed again, longer this time, deeper, full of passion and promise. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless and happy, grinning at each other like fools. They stayed up late into the night, making plans and talking about the future, imagining all the possibilities that lay ahead of them. The next morning, they rode into Carlin together and went straight to the small church at the edge of town. The minister, a kindly man named Reverend Michaels, agreed to marry them that very afternoon. Fiona sent word to a few people she'd become friendly with, and Dalton asked Sheriff Crawford to stand as his witness. By 3 o'clock, they were standing before the altar, Fiona in her best dress and Dalton in a clean shirt and jacket he'd borrowed from the general store owner, speaking their vows to each other. "I, Dalton Jeremiah, take you, Fiona Zimmerman, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to love you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days of my life." "I, Fiona Zimmerman, take you, Dalton Jeremiah, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she replied, her voice equally firm. I promise to love you, support you, and stand by your side for all the days of my life." Reverend Michaels pronounced them man and wife, and Dalton kissed his bride with such tenderness that several of the women present wiped away tears. They signed the marriage certificate, said their thanks and goodbyes, and rode back to the cabin as the sun was setting, husband and wife, ready to begin their new life together. That night, they consummated their marriage with passion and tenderness, learning each other's bodies as they had learned each other's minds and hearts over the previous days. Fiona had been nervous, having no experience with physical intimacy, but Dalton was patient and gentle, taking his time to make sure she felt safe and cherished. By the time they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, both were sated and happy, convinced they had made the right choice. The next 2 weeks passed in blissful domesticity. They worked on improving the cabin, making it more suitable for 2 people. Dalton built a larger bed frame and Fiona sewed curtains from fabric she bought in town. They spent their evenings reading together, talking and making love, discovering new depths to their relationship with each passing day. Fiona had never been happier, and Dalton walked around with a permanent smile on his face that made him look years younger. Then, on a cold morning in early March, Sheriff Crawford rode up to the cabin with news. Vincent Carson had been spotted 2 counties over, trying to recruit new men for his depleted gang. The law was closing in on him, and it was only a matter of time before he was captured or killed. "Thought you'd want to know," Crawford said, accepting a cup of coffee from Fiona. "Looks like your troubles with the Carson Gang are over, Mrs. Jeremiah." Fiona smiled at the use of her married name. "That's wonderful news, Sheriff. Thank you for coming all the way out here to tell us." "Well, there's actually another reason I came," Crawford said, looking at Dalton. "The town council met yesterday, and they've decided they want to hire a proper deputy. Someone with experience who can help keep the peace. The pay's not great, but it comes with a house in town and a steady income." He paused. "I'd like to offer you the job, Dalton. You proved yourself when you took down those outlaws, and your record in Montana speaks for itself." Dalton looked at Fiona, silently asking her opinion. She thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "It would be nice to live closer to town," she said. "And I could go back to teaching at the school if we had a house there, but only if it's what you want, Dalton. I'm happy here too." "I think I'd like to try it," Dalton said slowly. "I left law work because I was tired of the violence, but maybe in a small town like Carlin, it would be different. More about keeping the peace than chasing killers." He looked at Crawford. "I'll take the job, Sheriff, on one condition. If it starts to wear on me the way it did in Montana, I can resign without hard feelings." "Fair enough," Crawford said, extending his hand. "Welcome to the Carlin Sheriff's Department, Deputy Jeremiah." They moved to town the following week, into a small but sturdy house on Maple Street, not far from the school. Fiona went to the school board and asked for her position back, and they agreed immediately, relieved to have their competent teacher return. Dalton started his new job, working alongside Sheriff Crawford to patrol the town and handle disputes. It was quieter work than he'd done in Montana, more about breaking up saloon fights and tracking down stolen horses than gunfights with outlaws, and he found he liked it. The town gradually accepted them, the gossip about their hasty marriage fading as people saw how genuinely happy they were together. Fiona's students adored her, and she threw herself into her teaching with renewed energy. Dalton became a familiar and respected figure on the streets of Carlin, known for his fairness and his calm demeanor in tense situations. They became part of the community, invited to church socials and town meetings, building friendships and putting down the roots neither of them had ever had before. In June, Fiona discovered she was pregnant. She told Dalton one evening after supper, watching nervously for his reaction. His face lit up like the sun, and he swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "We're going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "A son or daughter, our child." "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he said, kissing her soundly. "You've given me everything, Fiona. A home, a purpose, love, and now a family. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God every day that you ran through that blizzard and ended up at my door." "I thank God for you too," she said softly. "You saved my life that day in more ways than one." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in February of 1885, almost exactly a year after they'd met, Fiona gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Daniel, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's bright eyes. Dalton was besotted with his son, spending every free moment holding him and talking to him, making plans for his future. Fiona recovered quickly from the birth and returned to teaching after a few months, with Daniel spending his days being looked after by a kindly neighbor woman who loved children. Word came in March that Vincent Carson had been killed in a shootout with federal marshals in Utah. The last member of the Carson Gang was dead, and the threat that had brought Dalton and Fiona together was finally, truly over. They held a small celebration that evening, toasting their good fortune and the life they'd built together. The years passed peacefully. Daniel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved books as much as his parents did. In 1887, Fiona gave birth to a daughter they named Diana, who had her mother's delicate features and her father's steady temperament. The house on Maple Street rang with laughter and the sounds of children playing, and Dalton and Fiona remained as devoted to each other as they had been on their wedding day. Dalton continued to work as a deputy, but he also kept his mining claim, working it on weekends and holidays. In 1889, he struck a significant vein of silver that brought them unexpected wealth. They used the money to build a larger house on the outskirts of Carlin, with enough room for their growing family and a real library where they could keep all their books. Fiona continued teaching, becoming the head teacher at the school and mentoring younger teachers who came to Carlin. In 1891, their third child was born, another boy they named David. By then, Daniel was 6 and Diana was 4, and both were excited to have a baby brother. The family was complete, happy, and thriving. Everything Dalton and Fiona had dreamed of during those first days together in the cabin. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dalton surprised Fiona with a trip back to that cabin where they'd met. He'd maintained it over the years, keeping it as a retreat where they could escape when life in town got too hectic. They left the children with friends and spent a weekend there together, just the two of them, reminiscing about that fateful day when 9 men had chased her through a blizzard and a cowboy had saved her life. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you'd turned me away?" Fiona asked as they sat by the fire, just as they had a decade earlier. "Never," Dalton said firmly, "because I wouldn't have. Even if I'd known it would lead to a gunfight, even if I'd known 6 men would die, I still would have pulled you inside. Some things are meant to be, Fiona, and you and I are one of them." "I believe that too," she said, snuggling closer to him. "Every choice we made that day, every moment of fear and courage led us here, led us to this life, this family, this love." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance, both thinking about how much their lives had changed. Fiona had gone from a lonely schoolteacher running for her life to a beloved wife and mother with a family and a purpose. Dalton had gone from a solitary prospector hiding from his past to a respected lawman with a wife he adored and children who filled his days with joy. "I love you," Fiona said softly. "More now than even on the day we married. I didn't think that was possible, but it is. Every day I love you more." "And I love you," Dalton replied, kissing the top of her head. "You're my heart, Fiona, my home. Everything good in my life comes from you." They made love that night in the narrow cot where Fiona had first slept after her rescue, and it was as passionate and tender as it had been on their wedding night. In the morning, they rode back to Carlin and their children, back to their real life, but they carried the memory of that weekend with them, a reminder of where they'd started and how far they'd come. The years continued to pass in contentment. Daniel grew into a serious young man who wanted to study law. Diana became a talented artist who filled the house with her drawings and paintings. David was the most adventurous of the three, always getting into mischief and keeping his parents on their toes. Dalton eventually became sheriff when Tom Crawford retired in 1895, and he held the position with distinction for many years. Fiona remained at the school until 1898, when she finally retired to focus on her family and her own writing, penning stories about life in the West that were published in magazines back east. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Dalton and Fiona stood on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the Nevada hills. They were both in their 40s now, with streaks of gray in their hair and lines around their eyes, but they were still deeply in love, still devoted to each other and the life they'd built together. 16 years, Fiona said, leaning against her husband. 16 years since that blizzard. "Best day of my life," Dalton said. "The day you came running through that storm and into my life. I was so scared," she remembered. "I thought I was going to die. Instead, you lived," he said. "We both did, and we built something beautiful together." Their children were growing up, making their own plans for the future. Daniel was studying at a university in San Francisco, preparing for a career in law. Diana was engaged to a young man who owned a photography studio in Reno. David, at 9 years old, was already talking about becoming a cowboy and riding the range. The house would be quiet in a few years, empty of children, but Fiona and Dalton knew they'd still have each other, and that was enough. "You have any regrets?" Fiona asked. "Not a single one," Dalton said without hesitation. "I've lived a full life, a good life because of you. I've been loved and I've loved in return. I've raised children and helped keep the peace in a town that needed it. What more could a man ask for?" "Nothing," Fiona agreed. "You're right. We've been blessed, you and I." They stood together as the stars came out, the same stars that had watched over them that night in the cabin 16 years ago. The wind rustled through the sage brush, carrying the scent of the desert and the promise of another day. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and Dalton pulled Fiona closer, protective even after all these years. "I'll always keep you safe," he murmured into her hair. "Just like I promised that first night." "I know," she said, "and I'll always love you just like I promised at our wedding." They went inside together, closing the door on the night, secure in their love and the life they'd created. The story that had begun with terror and violence in a blizzard had become a tale of love and family, of two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. In the years that followed, they watched their children grow and start families of their own. Daniel became a successful lawyer in San Francisco and gave them 3 grandchildren. Diana opened an art gallery in Reno with her husband and had 2 daughters. David eventually became a rancher, buying land north of Carlin where he raised cattle and horses, and he gave them 4 grandchildren who loved to visit and hear stories about the old days. Dalton retired as sheriff in 1910, at the age of 56, and he and Fiona spent their later years traveling, visiting their children and grandchildren, and enjoying the peace they'd earned. They returned often to the cabin where they'd met, keeping it maintained as a testament to where their story had begun. They would sit by the fire, older now but still in love, and remember that day when fate had brought them together. In 1925, as they celebrated their 41st wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren in the house they'd built together, Fiona looked at Dalton and saw the same man who had opened his door to a terrified woman in a blizzard all those years ago. He was older, grayer, moving more slowly now, but his eyes still held the same warmth and love they'd had on their wedding day. "Thank you," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "For what?" he asked, taking her hand. "For everything," she said. "For saving my life that day, for loving me. For giving me this beautiful family and this wonderful life. For being exactly who you are." "Thank you," he replied, raising her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "For running through that blizzard. For trusting me. For saying yes when I asked you to marry me. For every day we've had together." They kissed, and their grandchildren giggled and made teasing comments, but Dalton and Fiona didn't care. They had earned this moment, this happiness, through years of love and devotion and partnership. They had built a legacy together, not just in their children and grandchildren, but in the way they'd lived their lives with integrity and kindness and faith in each other. As the sun set on their anniversary celebration, painting the Nevada sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Fiona and Dalton stood together on their porch one more time, watching the land they loved. They were both in their 70s now, near the end of their journey, but they had no regrets. They had lived fully and loved deeply, and that was all anyone could ask for. "I'd do it all again," Dalton said suddenly. "Do what?" Fiona asked. "Everything. The whole thing. If I could go back to that day in 1884 and choose whether to open my door or not, I'd make the same choice. I'd pull you inside, I'd shoot those men, I'd fall in love with you, I'd marry you, and I'd live this exact same life all over again." Fiona's eyes filled with tears, happy tears. "So would I," she whispered. "Every moment, every choice, every day with you. I'd do it all again without changing a thing." They stood together as the stars emerged, the same eternal stars that had witnessed their story unfold over 4 decades. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in the hills, the same coyotes sang their ancient songs. The world had changed so much since that day in the blizzard, but some things remained constant. Love, family, devotion, the bond between two people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other every day for 41 years. Inside the house, their family laughed and talked. 3 generations gathered together because 2 people had met in a blizzard and fallen in love. The legacy of that single day, that single choice to open a door and offer shelter, had rippled out through time, creating lives and love that would continue long after Dalton and Fiona were gone. They went inside together, hand in hand, to rejoin their family. The story that had begun with 9 men chasing a woman through a blizzard and a cowboy who shot 6 of them had become something far greater than either of them could have imagined. It had become a love story for the ages, a testament to courage and kindness, and the power of 2 hearts finding each other in the wilderness. And as they sat surrounded by their children and grandchildren, sharing stories and laughter late into the night, Dalton and Fiona knew that they had been blessed beyond measure. They had found each other in the darkest moment, and from that darkness had built a life filled with light and love. They had survived the blizzard, both literal and metaphorical, and emerged stronger for it. They had created a family, a legacy, a story that would be told and retold through the generations. It was everything they had hoped for and more. A happy ending to a story that had begun in terror and violence, but had become something beautiful and enduring. And when they finally went to bed that night, tired but happy, they fell asleep in each other's arms just as they had on their wedding night 41 years earlier. Still in love, still devoted, still grateful for the day when fate had brought them together in a blizzard in Nevada.